Right on. Because you know, or you will find out, that the devil's in the details, and it's those little confusing things no one's heard of where all this stuff happens. But we're going to have a very exciting conversation here that's going to involve the biggest power on the internet, United States Congress, the infrastructure of the telecommunications system, hackers everywhere. It's essentially the Da Vinci Code of obscure technology. That's what we're going to have tonight. We're going to ask and maybe answer the question about whether your cable guy is spying on you, but definitely going to answer the question that he or she could, as could a whole lot of other people. My name is Sean Captain. I'm a tech, business and science and whatever else catches my interest journalist. You can mainly find me at Fast Company. And I'm going to ask our fantastic experts to give me a sentence about who they all are. I'm going to start with Marshall.
Yep. Marshall Irwin. I'm Director of Trust and Security at Mozilla. I work on a whole host of privacy and security initiatives in our product and also some of our policy work.
I'm Tejas Narchenia. I'm Assistant Professor of Law at UC Berkeley, the School of Law there, where I teach courses on telecommunications regulation and intellectual property.
Hi, I'm Mona. I'm a staff technologist at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I have been advising on our position and advocacy for encrypted DNS at EFF, and I otherwise work on encryption software.
Great. So I'm going to ask y'all a couple things, and whoever wants to jump in and whoever wants to jump in on top of what they're saying or contradict or whatever else, it's all good. A lot of us might know what DNS is or maybe know what DNS is, but just to get things started, can someone briefly describe what DNS is? You want to take it?
I can give it a shot.
Sure.
Yeah, sure. So DNS is, as Sean described, a 35-year-old technology that powers the internet and how it works. So every time you use a network-connected device, it's using DNS. Let's say you visit a NewYorkTimes.com in your browser. Your computer doesn't actually know what NewYorkTimes.com means. So in order to translate that semantic phrase, NewYorkTimes.com, into an address that your machine understands, it has to look it up in this address book. And this address book of the internet is what DNS provides. And so these address books, we usually refer to them as DNS providers or DNS resolvers. Yeah. Have anything to add?
Yeah, so I'll just piggyback, maybe to preempt one of Sean's next question. What mentioned 35-year-old technology. What we think is pretty remarkable about the DNS today is just that, despite some huge effort across the industry to modernize the architecture of the web in recent years, things like TLS, growing use and adoption of HTTPS.
And just real quick, what TLS and HTTPS are?
These are essentially the encryption standards that are encrypting your traffic as you browse around the web. So none of that work has touched the DNS. And what that means is that when you're using this phone book for the web, you are essentially sending the address that you want to browse to, unencrypted, to your DNS resolver. Again, actually a pretty remarkable fact given all of the work that we have all done to build a more secure web, the fact that all of your browsing activity is essentially being disclosed and unencrypted across the web. Typically to a resolver that you don't know who it is. It might be provided by your ISP, might be provided by in your local Wi-Fi network, but one way or the other, you don't really know who's providing that service, and you're disclosing your browsing activity to them.
So what kind of dangers I think you're starting to answer that, but so the fact is you're basically telling whoever this address book provider is, here's where I want to go on the web. That seems to make sense, right? Because you have to tell someone so you can get there. Mm-hmm. So what problems does this pose, the way it works right now?
I can talk a little bit more. So Marshall provided a great overview of some of the privacy problems that can arise when you're using DNS, because you have to, and it's unencrypted. Another thing that is less highlighted, but also just as dangerous, are the security problems that DNS have. When you ask your address book to translate one of these names into an address, that request passes through many people, right? And you don't necessarily know who these agents are. One of them is probably the person who operates your Wi-Fi network, people who run the ISP, whatever. And any one of those agents can manipulate or even change or block the requests that you're sending, right? So if I ask, where is NewYorkTimes.com, anyone on that path could just say, oh, NewYorkTimes.com, that doesn't exist. Sorry. Or
Who might do such a thing?
China, all the time for many websites, not just news sites, sites that provide VPNs, sites that provide a service is for messaging apps. Yeah.
And then what about, I mean, could hackers take advantage of this as well?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, on your Wi-Fi network, anyone on your Wi-Fi network can see the websites that you're visiting, right? So, yeah, you can think about it. Like, do you trust the people who are on your Wi-Fi network, like sitting at Starbucks.com or Starbucks with you, or at school, or at your workplace? Yeah.
By the way, if you Google WeWork password, you can get on the WeWork network anywhere in the world, and you can find that in about 10 seconds. We wrote about that. But I mean, that puts the point out. Some people are on Wi-Fi networks that aren't secure at all or very, very weakly secured. So that's a really big threat as well. Yeah.
I mean, that's right. I think not only the lack of encryption means that someone sitting in the middle of that network can collect data about you, but in addition, they can actually tamper with the responses in ways that can cause you additional harm. So that's sort of the two core risks there that result from the fact that your DNS traffic isn't typically encrypted. Right. One is that the data can just be collected, and two, it can be tampered with and possibly misdirect you. If it's the phone book of the internet and you're being given the wrong number, well, that can be a serious problem.
Anybody ever mistype something and get this weird, like, advertising-looking page saying either you can buy this domain or you can whatever? Is this a DNS thing? Is this a DNS issue?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I mean, it depends, but I think the answer is it often is. So,
What's happening?
The DNS resolver returns a result based on what you've looked up. So if you've looked up NewYorkTimes.com, or maybe you've looked up yntmies.cmo, right? You're a terrible typist. The DNS resolver will return a null result, or that's what it ought to result.
Meaning just doesn't
nothing.
Doesn't
right?
work, right?
This doesn't exist. This actually doesn't exist. But what can happen is your ISP can read that null result and change it to send you to some other site, which is, well, we think what you meant was NewYorkTimes.com. Or do you want to buy this domain so you can trap other poor typists? Or, right, so right, that's an example of the data being, the result being manipulated by your ISP.
Right.
Because what you're supposed to get is no, like, you made a mistake, go fix it. Instead, what you're getting is, here's some spammy website telling you to buy this thing, or serving up something to you, or that's trying to infer what it is that you meant to type, and is slowly building a profile about, one, where you went to go, and two, how good of a typist you are.
So, I mean, I can say on one level, it could be a service, right? Like, we type something wrong, we think you probably meant this. Just like when I type something wrong in Google, they say, did you mean New York Times and not Winching, whatever I typed in. So, I mean, it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Or...
So I think it's a little different in that with Google, you at least know that you intended to give this information to Google. And you might want Google to try to point you to a helpful site. You don't always know, to Mona's point, who is returning or who's manipulating this data in the middle. And I don't think the average internet user is aware that somebody, their ISP, their Wi-Fi provider, is logging this. And that's the difference.
So do we know that someone is logging this? Getting back to the cable guy question.
So I do think we know a lot about how things like web targeting works. And generally, our view at this point is that the sort of pervasive surveillance economy that exists today has resulted in a broken business model of the web. And we have tried to do a lot about that. What I think is really remarkable about some of this DNS-based targeting is no one has any idea how it works. It might involve building a profile about you. It might involve taking that data, targeting against it. Typically, when you're seeing ads, people are measuring your response to those ads and building a profile. Again, is that how this targeting is working? I don't think we really know. The opacity in the system is pretty remarkable. And that's, I think, one thing that we think is really critical to understand.
Don't we have some privacy law or regulation that would stop this from happening? Tejas?
No, we don't. The privacy protections that are available to internet users in this regard are really low. It depends whether or not you are protected against this sort of tracking, right? Assuming you don't want to be tracked in this way, depends entirely on whether or not the service provider has disclosed to you in the terms of service that nobody in this room has read. Right? Nobody, I guarantee that nobody in this room has read those terms of service closely. But if it's in there, if it's been disclosed, then there's a good chance it's not illegal. Then the only time you can be, or a provider can be held liable is for fraudulently tracking you, for engaging in deceptive or misleading conduct.
If they say we're not going to do it, but they do it.
Right.
So can I just add to this? So we've been talking about what sometimes is described as sort of DNS hijacking. Basically, again, targeting off a domain that is misspelled. A few other useful examples to think about are like the Verizon Selects program. Sometimes you think of this as the Verizon super cookie, right? We have done a fair amount of effort to try to understand like the privacy notice and the privacy properties associated with that cookie, that super cookie. And the Selects program, I would challenge anybody to read the privacy disclosure that Verizon provides for the Verizon Selects program, essentially the super cookie program, and try to determine if DNS data is being collected and targeted against.
Can you remind us?
I do not know.
Can you remind us what the super cookie is, basically?
It's essentially an initiative that Verizon kicked off about 3 or 4 years ago. You guys, super cookie, because it is essentially assigning an identifier to its users and using that to track those users and build a profile against them. Essentially, it's going to be.
And it might be using DNS as well as other
And it might be
things.
using DNS, and again, if you go read the privacy disclosure, I think you'll have a really difficult time determining it one way or the other.
Well, we're going to come back to that issue of disclosures and what companies say in a little bit, because there's some interesting developments along those lines. So I guess the question would be then, we've got a problem. Does anybody have an idea for a solution? That's definitely a send up.
Yeah,
For
so
any of you.
I mean, I can talk a little bit about that. So the two problems we highlighted earlier, which were integrity, protection against tampering, and then also security, which is people can't read it except for the two endpoints that were intended to be communicating. Beyond fixing those two, we also want a solution that is not downgradable. And so what I mean by that is, let's say your ISP sees something that looks like an encrypted DNS request. If they can recognize or distinguish that it is an encrypted DNS request, they can just say, drop that, right? They can't read the packets, but they can drop them.
I just want to back up a
Sure.
second, just so we introduce what an encrypted DNS request is.
Oh, sure. Yeah,
essentially.
sorry.
Yeah.
When I say encrypted DNS request, I mean encrypting the traffic between you and your DNS provider. So you and the address book, so that it's only you and the address book who know what is being communicated, and any sort of tampering can be identified.
So that would rule out like the person who's like on your Wi-Fi network wouldn't be able to see it, for example. All those sort of men in the middle or persons in the middle. Okay, but now we were concerned about your DNS provider seeing what you're doing. They're still seeing it, right? Because you have a secure connection to them. But do you trust them?
Well, you shouldn't necessarily.
Oops.
So you shouldn't necessarily trust them, right? Which is, again, you point out like the other part of the threat model that we're trying to solve for. So the first part being the encryption of the DNS queries, and then the second part being like actually trusting whoever is providing that service.
Right.
So what we are doing in the Firefox browser is We are attempting to essentially ship a DNS resolver with Firefox so that when users begin to browse the web using Firefox, their DNS queries will be sent using DNS over HTTPS or DOE. So the queries will be encrypted, and they will be sent to a partner that we have identified that we believe is trustworthy and is subject to a strong set of policy requirements that protect our users.
Now, where is this DNS encryption technology coming from? Is this something that Mozilla invented?
So this is mostly coming from the IETF, basically the sort of internet standards body that has standardized most of the core protocols.
So this is
the
a
web
standard
runs.
then that other companies could adopt as well? Or?
That's right, yes.
Okay, cool. Who's this wonderful DNS provider that we can all trust?
Yeah, so our partner for our initial rollout is Cloudflare. We have been working with them closely for more than a year, probably going back to, I think, about June 2018. First to test this service, again, with the goal now being, as we speak, to actually roll this out to all of our US users. When we began working with Cloudflare, we believed, and Cloudflare agreed with us, that there needed to be a strong set of privacy protections to make sure that this data wasn't going to be abused. And so Cloudflare had agreed to those protections. We have a policy, we call it our Trusted Recursive Resolver policy. Essentially says that the data from the service can only be retained for 24 hours and can only be used strictly for the purpose of providing that service. And the provider has to maintain a public privacy notice that attests to exactly what those policies are. So Cloudflare is our partner right now. We are actively looking for additional partners because we want to build out this program so that we don't just have one provider, but we have a number of providers that honor this critical set of policies that we've established so that we can build out an ecosystem of these DOE resolvers.
Is this all making sense so far? We're not going too fast? Okay, cool. What's Cloudflare get out of this? I mean, we don't have a Cloudflare representative here, Marshall. So you're hitting for them.
What's Cloudflare getting out of this? Well, I think the fact is, like, a DNS service isn't that expensive to run if you're a company that operates at the scale of Cloudflare. Okay. Mm-hmm. Just like Mozilla, there are a number of reasons we offer privacy and security features. The core reason is because we want to build a better web. Part of it is because we want to actually provide a value proposition that allows our browser to be competitive and actually build out our brand, frankly. Like, that's part of the reason that we build privacy features. I think that's part of what Cloudflare gets out of this too, is being on the side of a more private and secure web is actually a good thing for companies today. And I think that's part of what motivates Cloudflare.
And Cloudflare, just as an aside, it's essentially a network that when you go through Cloudflare, they can optimize your traffic. So they can essentially get your web requests or your traffic through the internet quicker. That's their selling feature, right? Because they basically operate a ton of server farms all around the world that do that. They also provide kind of like a wall between you and the rest of the internet, so they're a security provider as well. So DNS is not something that they make money off of, but it's something that they do as part of the services they provide. Interesting what you said about the the pledge that they've made and the terms that you have that that they won't maintain records. I assume also that they won't sell the records, right, or something like that. So I wrote a piece earlier this week about this technology. Basically, how can you stop your ISP from spying on you? I mentioned using Firefox and some other things you can do and some other things that are happening. And I got an email from Comcast. And they said, just so you know, we do not spy on you. We do not maintain records. They sent me a blog post that had been published like a minute before they emailed me, which I don't flatter myself thinking they did it just because of me. It had been in the news. And a couple things that they said, where you go on the internet is your business, not ours. As your internet service provider, we do not track the websites you visit or apps you use through your broadband connection because we don't track that information. We don't use to build a profile about you. And we have never sold that information to anyone. And then they say again that they don't sell that information to anyone. And then they say we delete DNS queries we have as an internet service provider every 24 hours. Which sounds like there's close, at least in basic principle, I mean there's more to this, similar to what you're asking of DNS resolvers, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I appreciate the statement that they put out. I think it's actually a really strong statement, and to their credit, they were willing to put that statement out and attest to exactly what their policies are. You know, this has been a somewhat bruising debate recently between us and to some extent Comcast, but I think that's a positive. That's a positive development. We're all working to build a more secure web, and so I think that's a really strong statement, and really appreciated them putting it out. I'll say, I felt actually pretty proud when I saw that statement, because that 24-hour policy is a policy that we essentially established with our partner Cloudflare, and we think it's essentially it should be an industry standard, and we encourage other companies to essentially say what Comcast has said here. The one thing that I do want to highlight from that statement, which I think is really interesting, you skipped over it, but there's a line in there that I think says something to the effect that we do not sell our customers' location data. And I have no reason to think that that's not accurate. I don't think they would have said it if it's not accurate. I think it's interesting that they did say it, however. And I think it calls it, the debate about DNS over HTTPS is not about location data.
Right.
So it begs the question, why is it in there, right? I think it's in there because, well, Comcast has said that they don't sell your location data. A number of other providers have been found to actually selling users' their subscribers' location data over the last year, which is actually pretty remarkable. I think it's sort of a privacy scandal on the scale of Cambridge Analytica. It's been somewhat underappreciated. And what it actually demonstrates is the remarkable access that these providers have to your data, and the fact that, again, the way in which that data is used and whether it is targeted or sold is extremely opaque. And in the case of location data especially, users had no idea. Again, so I think that's why that's in there. Again, I think I have no reason to question the statement, and I strongly suspect they would not have said that if it were not accurate. But I think the reason it is in there is because this has been a critical problem over the last year for the industry, and that's why they felt the need to highlight it.
And Comcast is not the only ISP, although they seem like it sometimes. So obviously it's a question of what is Verizon doing, what is Time Warner doing, what is everyone else doing as well. Have any other ones come out saying what their DNS policy is or privacy policies are, to your knowledge? No?
I don't know of any other ISP that has announced a DNS policy.
Okay.
No.
Now, Tejas, so this is their blog post. Could we hold them to that they say they won't do that?
I think so. I mean, I think that this is, I think if Comcast were to hold themselves out by this blog post, sending it to reputable journalists, sort of saying, look, this is what we do, I think that it would be deceptive or misleading to then turn around and do exactly what they disclaimed from doing. So yeah, I think we can hold them to this, and like Marshall said, I think it's a strong statement, it's an important statement, and it's good that one of the leading ISPs has committed to doing some of the things that seem to be most important. It's not perfect, and we can talk about different problems with it, but looks like you want to jump in.
I also wanted to say Comcast is also lobbying Congress to stop the deployment of encrypted DNS.
Right, and that's the thing that's definitely one of the reasons why that blog post came out, I think. So we've talked about what Mozilla is doing. Is something going on with Google that we should know about? Anyone, Tejas?
Sure.
Go ahead.
I can say what Google is doing, but we don't have anyone.
Right.
So Google is not doing what Mozilla is doing, which is changing the default DNS provider for people in the US to one of these trusted recursive resolvers. Google is instead saying, okay, we see you're reaching out to this address book. If we can, we're going to upgrade that connection to an encrypted one. Yeah.
And whose encrypted one would they upgrade it to?
The same provider, right? So
so if the ISP...
Same, so let's say your default DNS provider was run by Comcast. If Comcast offers a DNS or an encrypted DNS version of that address book, then Chrome will upgrade your connection to that encrypted one.
So that kind of reminds me of in the earlier days when you type HTTP, if the site had an HTTPS an encrypted version, you'd get that. Sort of like that. You kind of get bumped up to encrypted?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So does Comcast, for example? Oh, go ahead.
Well, I'll just to point out the critical property there is that there's no party that's going to be getting additional data that isn't already getting that because they're not actually switching over your DNS provider
Right.
to something other than the service that you already have. Which is,
So-
again, a little bit different than our
So
approach.
again, you're protecting yourself from, say, a hacker who might be looking at your traffic that's not encrypted, but whether or not you trust Comcast, Verizon, whatever, that issue is still there.
That's right.
So I guess the question is then, if the DNS, now I heard you were telling me, Mona, that Comcast actually is experimenting with encrypted DNS?
Yeah, I actually got an email, probably from the same person this morning. They were like, "Oh, I saw you're on this panel. Have you seen? We have this experimental encrypted DNS endpoint up." Yeah.
So some things are moving in the right direction. So that's interesting. At least they're listening. But why is it that Congress is now getting involved? Because a bunch of ISPs and their trade groups have sent a letter, and EFF has sent a letter along with some other organizations as well. What's going on? What prompted all this then?
I mean, what prompted it was the letter that the ISPs wrote, and it was filled with things that were just plainly not true and lots of logical fallacies and lots of terrible
And that was
things.
regarding Google?
Yeah, regarding Google, right?
Okay.
Because so Mozilla is the one that is experimenting with changing people's default DNS provider to one that has a stronger privacy policy, right? Or under the trusted recursive resolver policy. And then this letter was saying that Google was going to do the same thing and then shuttle all of your DNS data to Google, which is just plainly false.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I haven't been able to figure out exactly what the letter is saying and exactly what they want Google to, or what they want Congress to do. But my understanding is that what the premise of the letter is that all of this DNS data, which is currently now distributed across the ISPs, right? Comcast and Verizon and maybe a few others, will all now just get shunted to Google because of Chrome's market share and this representation in the letter that Google's going to change your default DNS provider to 1.1 or 8.8.8.8,
Which is Google's.
Which is Google's.
Google's provider.
And then I think what the sort of policy action item for Congress or maybe for the FTC or the Department of Justice is, look, Google's getting an even greater stranglehold on this data. We should be worried about the amount of power that Google has over personal data. You should kick off a further antitrust investigation into the monopolization of antitrust, the monopolization of this data. Mm-hmm. So Google's leveraging its monopoly or its market power in Chrome into the market for DNS search data, which, as we discussed, we're not really sure what that market looks like at this point.
Right, but Google said that they're just going to send you to the same DNS server you would go to anyway. You just, instead of Comcast, it would be encrypted Comcast or whoever else. But that's not what the letter says, right?
That's my understanding.
Yeah. By the way, this letter was
I
sent to the majority and minority leader of 3 Senate committees and 3 House committees. I mean, just the address is on the letter is almost as long as the whole letter, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we think is happening with that letter, as well as the deck that was made public this week, it's essentially an effort to sort of take advantage of Google as the big boogeyman here, as the big boogeyman, essentially. You know, there's a lot of angst right now about the market power that Google has. Now, it's not a valid argument in this context, but it's nonetheless something that's going to grab people's attention and ask people to ask, like, what is this DNS over HTTPS thing, and do I need to understand it and look at it a lot more closely? So I think that's the strategy that's being employed behind that letter. You know, we think, frankly, again, like, our approach is actually more aggressive. It's an approach that we stand by, but it's more difficult to attack Mozilla directly on this. Frankly, we're a corporation owned by a nonprofit with a history of trying to build a more private and secure web. That looks a little bit different to attack our work than to attack the company that has sort of a large market share. And I think that's essentially the strategy that you see being deployed in that letter.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this attention is warranted, right? Google is a big bad, just not on this front. They do have like monopoly market share on like with Chrome in the browsers and Android in the phones. So it's very dangerous. If they did decide to do this thing that the ISPs are all claiming that they're doing, it would be very bad.
Because companies will say one thing and then 2 years later do something else. I mean, Facebook is famous for that, right? So Google could be like, oh, you know what? I think we are going to send Joel to our DNS server after all. But Tejas, you and I were talking about something else that might be going on, why the ISPs are so concerned about DNS servers. Actually, Marshall mentioned it as well. But is net neutrality part of this?
So I don't know whether net neutrality is part of this. But there's reason to think that net neutrality could be affected by this.
Okay, how so?
So I'm trying to decide how much to unwind.
We got 8 minutes.
Okay, I won't use all of it.
Please don't.
So basically, whether or not ISPs can be subject to net neutrality rules depends on what the FCC decides to call them. Whether the FCC decides to call them telecommunications providers or information service providers.
Like a phone company versus
whether,
whatever an information provider is.
Yeah, so the terms come from actually when AT&T used to transmit data to Ross Perot's data processing companies. And that's where the distinction comes from. But it's basically, are you a data processing company or are you a data transit company? Or do you transmit data between two endpoints? And so if you want to make ISPs subject to net neutrality rules, the FCC has to decide to call them transit companies and not information process companies, because the FCC has the authority to regulate those telecommunications transit companies, but no authority to regulate the others. And it turns out that DNS is really, really important to the distinction. So whether or not you think of DNS as part of the core service provision of an ISP, if you think of it that way, then you would say, oh, well, what they're doing is information processing, because they're processing NewYorkTimes.com, translating it to a numerical address, and then directing you accordingly. But if you think of it as simply an adjunct to the transit service, we're trying to connect you to 17.63.something.something, which happens to be in NewYorkTimes.com, and this is just a way for us to resolve that, kind of like call forwarding, then it's a transit service. And so the FCC has changed its mind about DNS back and forth. Oh, this is just an adjunct to the transit function. Oh, no, this is a core information processing capability. And as the FCC changes its mind, it's changing its mind about whether or not it can impose or should impose net neutrality rules.
So I'm not just dialing the phone number of the New York Times, right? The IP address, right? You're providing some special servers. You're saying, oh, let me help you with that. I'm going to look up here in my book and do this. And because of that, I'm not just a phone company. I'm this whole service that guides you through the internet.
Yeah, so it's kind of like, what you do is what you're doing dialing 1-800-NY-TIMES, and that's automatically forwarded to some local 212 exchange in New York, or is what you're doing dialing 0, talking to an operator, saying, please connect me to the New York Times, and the operator moves the cables on the switchboard and connects you to the New York Times. Which one of those is DNS more like? And does that mean that this is more like an information service or a telecommunication service?
So if I'm going through Cloudflare, for example, I'm not even using Comcast's DNS, so Comcast can't say, oh, well, we're not just a phone company because we're a DNS provider. It's like, well, no, you're not, right, in this case.
Right. And so, that's exactly it. DNS is like, so it used to be that the ISPs would give you DNS, and they'd give you web space, and they'd give you an email address, and they still give you all these things, but no one uses their Comcast.net email address. No one hosts a web page at Comcast.com/lawprof. So because no one does that, those information services aren't valuable. The information service that's still valuable is DNS. But if people stop using their ISP's DNS service, then the case that the ISPs are information services becomes weaker. It's better to call them telecommunication service, which means it's more likely that they ought to be subject to net neutrality-like rules, or can be subject to net neutrality rules.
Yeah, so I just to add to this, to go back to the kind of lobbying effort, I think what we are really struggling with is trying to understand like what is really motivating what we feel like is a pretty massive effort to push back and sort of to prevent this DOE deployment, right? And so there's essentially sort of three theories that you can ask. Like one, that there's something happening with this data right now that is not transparent. Two, they're trying to protect a future business model that uses this data. Or three, they're trying to protect the argument in the net neutrality case. Now, the Comcast statement would suggest that they're not using this data now and they don't have plans to. It doesn't say anything about other providers. But again, those are kind of the three possible explanations for what, again, amounts to a pretty massive lobbying effort. I'd be interested in other opinions in the room. We could sort of show of hands which one of those is right. But we are struggling to sort of explain that letter, the slide deck, and kind of just the underlying motive behind behind this.
So we've talked about Mozilla, we've talked about Google. Are the other tech companies, are they taking any, like, I mean, Apple's been pretty big on like ad blocking and things and tracking blocking. Have they said anything about this that we know of, or Microsoft?
So I don't know.
I don't actually know either on
Okay.
Apple or Microsoft.
Which
Yeah,
probably indicates they haven't.
Yeah, I was just wondering myself. I wonder what what Safari and Edge will do, but I don't know.
So
Yeah.
Apple's usually pretty like tight-lipped about things before they do them. So we might not know about Safari, but Edge is, I think it's based on Chromium, which is the
Right.
browser that Google develops. So unless they like explicitly, essentially like fork it and then remove the encryption part, then they'll have it too eventually. Yeah.
So we talked about the problem, and of course, there's always, we want to end with the solution before we start. You all start telling us, you know, your ideas and your questions. So say I'm buying this argument that I think my DNS should be encrypted for security or privacy, or just, hey, I want to have control. Can I do anything about it right now? Can I actually take advantage of this technology?
Should start using Firefox, and you can turn this on right now in the Firefox settings menu. I have, my parents have. I asked them to. So.
Okay. So that's enabled this using the encryption with Cloudflare? Is
That's right.
enabled now?
Yep.
Okay.
So it will use DOE and as Cloudflare as the provider.
Right. Okay. DOE being the encryption, right? Yeah. DNS over HTTPS, which is a very long thing to say. So, and then I'm guessing there's probably a blog post that says how to do that, explains all that.
Yes, and I'm not going to know the URL off the top of my head, but we essentially announced in September that we'd be turning this on for all of our users, and I think that blog post actually provides directions to do it, but you can easily find it online.
Or on fastcompany.com, by the way.
Yeah, or there.
And then is it going to stay optional, or is it going to become to get turned on by default at some point?
So it'll be turned on by default for all of our US users. Current users will see what we call a door hanger in the product that actually says, "Hey, we're turning this on. Click here to learn more." And then they'll also be able to go into the settings menu and actually turn it off if they want.
Okay, cool. And that's on the desktop or also on mobile, or?
It's just on desktop at this point.
Okay. Is there anything that can be done for mobile if you want to use the encryption?
So I think on Android they have a different flavor of DNS encryption, like DNS over TLS, and you can you can actually turn that on, but you have to specify like which provider you want to use.
Okay, so you have to pick Cloudflare or Google, but if you want to do that.
Yeah, for both iOS and Android, you can go into the settings and choose your own DNS provider.
And then what about the Cloudflare app too, the mobile app?
So I do not know as much about the Cloudflare app.
Okay.
You probably know more than I, other than that it's available. It uses their DOE service as well.
Yeah, I mean, to my understanding from writing about it, there's a free app from Cloudflare. It's called 1.1.1.1 because that's the internet address of their server. And we're out of time. And they launched it on like the 11th of November, and they make every announcement as some kind of pun about the name, and it's really annoying. But anyway, it is a free app, and it does two things actually. First, it would just switch your DNS over to their server, and then they just threw in a virtual private network. which is kind of fun. So you get a free, basically totally encrypted connection, not just your DNS. So I think that'll pretty much take care of you on iOS or Android, because as you said, the mobile browser doesn't have that currently. They also have some info on their site, which we link to at Fast Company, for how you can switch over Windows or Mac OS as well, or Linux for that matter as well. So you can do it in all of your operating systems, and if your browsers don't support it. But I think the easiest thing would be Mozilla, and then if you wanted to go mobile, to do the Cloudflare app. Assuming you trust Cloudflare, and Marshall's made a case for why you could, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I trust Cloudflare because they've got a best-in-class privacy notice that you can all go look at, and it documents exactly what data they collect, how long it's retained. It's better than any other privacy notice that you'll find for a DNS service.
So if we do use DNS encryption, DOH, are we set now on security, or are there other holes that we need to worry about in terms of how we communicate with servers on the internet?
Yeah, sure, I can talk about that. Yeah, so DNS is one of the larger privacy and security holes that exists on the internet today. There's also a leak of the website you're visiting when you have an HTTPS connection with a website. Yes, and that is a method through which like authoritarian regimes and et cetera block connections to particular websites.
So it's an ongoing.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, it's an ongoing battle.
Ongoing battle.
basically.
yeah, I mean, DOH doesn't solve every problem with the DNS, nor does it solve every other privacy leak that exists in the network. But it is a step in the right direction, and I think there are parallel efforts to really plug those other leaks, and we got to take them all seriously. We can't just decide to fix one and then call it a day.
Okay. Great. We're going to open up for questions, but I just want to know anything else that you all wanted to mention before we do that. All right. Great. I hope we confuse you just enough to have questions, but not so much that you throw your hands up in the air. So let's see where that's at. Yeah. Oh, you got it. Okay. Oh, hold on. You got a mic coming. Sorry about that. I jumped the gun.
Hi. Okay, so I'm trying to picture what this data looks like. Like, let's say Comcast was doing something nefarious, pulled all of your data, like off of your Wi-Fi router, right? Would they have kind of IP timestamp, requested domain, and then just basically every time, like, it'd just be like you went to Amazon this many times over the course of the month, or would it be, you know, what? Give me a sense of what it looks like.
Yeah, good question. Who understands that?
It's basically IP timestamp and the domains that you've been visiting.
The key is basically the IP. Do they know that, like, the sub pages? Oh, I went to Amazon to shop for this type of book, or, you know.
Yeah, but I think that the general lesson that we've taken away and sort of internalized at Mozilla regarding your browsing activity is that you can pretty easily identify an individual based on that browsing activity as long as you can tie it to an identifier and track that identifier over time. And so if you have the IP plus the actual browsing activity, it over time becomes pretty trivial to actually identify exactly who you are.
So you don't necessarily know what page they went to on Amazon, but you know they went to Amazon. And you know they went to a site for people who are HIV positive, or for transgender people, or something like
That's right.
that. Yeah, okay.
Hi. First of all, Pearl here. Berkeley Law, so I just finished from Berkeley Law, so go Bears.
Congrats.
Thank you. So yeah, like you mentioned, hope you didn't confused us enough to ask questions. So my concern is, like, for people who are not like STEM related and like they want to be part of this conversation, I fear that they would be confused to a large extent. And this is, like, you know, in relation to their data, for example. So like what can we do, like, moving forward to make this more digestible, right? Because like people need to be aware of like, you know, how to ensure that they're not being tracked, but like, at the same time, like how can we bring it down enough to like anyone to understand, you know, like people like me who didn't study, you know, computer engineering but law, so like how do we understand it better? How do we bring it down to everybody to understand? Thank you.
Let's go to our educator, Professor.
So I think one of the things that we can do are, one, try to really clearly articulate the stakes. So one, why is this important? Why should we care about this? And two, you try to put it in terms that your mother or your grandmother or your dad or your grandparent would be able to understand. So like, what's the right analogy that lots of people can relate to that describes exactly what's happening? So, you know, I think to take this as an example, the phone book example or the operator example, I think is a nice way of breaking down what is otherwise a really, you know, what is really like a complicated distributed database system. But it works because, you know, if you look back at the history of DNS, DNS replaces what was effectively a phone book. It used to be just a text file that was an IP address and the domain, and one person would maintain that, and so you couldn't get a new domain name until, you know, if it was the weekend or if it was Christmas or if it was New Year's. But now you can do it any time, and so, you know, looking back in history, figuring out what the right analogy is, and explaining why it's important, how the technology has developed over time in such a way to now, you know, leave threats open, and what those threats are to your sense of self, your personhood, your dignity, you know, your privacy, your autonomy, those concerns. I think that's the best way to get this message across to someone who's not steeped in the tech.
And then I think in terms of solution, if you wanted to just do the point-and-click solution.
Well, that's right. I mean, this is essentially why we are turning this feature on by default, is because we recognize that it's a complex issue and that most users, they might not have the technical knowledge or even the time to take action themselves. That puts a lot of pressure on consumers, which is why increasingly what we try to do is roll these protections out by default. I do really appreciate the question. It's generally something we have really struggled with regarding DNS over HTTPS because it's difficult to explain, and we put a lot of effort into trying to do it semi-successfully. It's not a trivial task, and sometimes we do a better job than other times. So.
Yeah, so this is really important to our team at EFF that focuses on encrypting the internet. So I work on a software that makes it easier for you to turn on encryption for your website. And one of the most important things that we have to do is to make sure it's as easy as possible to make the right decision. So what we really want is encrypted communications everywhere by default. You know, because it takes effort and there's overhead to learning all of this stuff.
I mean, what's always been helpful, I think, with the encrypted web connections, HTTPS, is the little lock icon, right? Okay, the icon's locked, boom, I'm good, you know, and we trust that. So then will Firefox like have some indication, like permanent indication that it's doing that? Or
will it have a permanent indication, like sort of in the...
That it's using encrypted DNS?
No, I mean, not as of right now. What we will, as I mentioned, sort of for existing users, they'll see this, what we call door hanger, letting them know that we're turning this on.
Ah, okay.
And then they'll be able to go into the settings and turn it off. But we won't have anything like that little lock icon at this point.
Okay, cool. Gotcha. Sure, I guess.
Hi, thank you so much for your time tonight. To what extent, if at all, do existing legislation like GDPR, the California Consumer Protection Act, touch on this DNS issue, or are the do not track clauses in those specific to just the websites themselves, not this DNS issue?
Good question.
Yeah, I mean, in Europe, I would think GDPR would apply to this. The challenge that we have when we think about federal privacy legislation in the U.S. as well as GDPR, you know, the breadth of those laws, you know, that we're strong supporters, but in the end, I like the set of protections that are built into the protocol and established with our partner in a contract that I can look at and tell you exactly what they are and what they mean. So I think that GDPR would be applicable here, but open to interpretation. You need some sort of data protection authority to look at it, understand the implications, investigate. It's a complex and broad law, and I'm always more comfortable complementing those laws with like an actual privacy feature that you can look at and know exactly what it's doing.
Hi, what are the arguments that are being lobbied by Comcast against DOH? And also, I have another question. Do DNS providers ever get subpoenaed or searched, and how does the government feel about DOH?
Question. It's a really good question. Anybody know?
Yeah, so the letter that we mentioned earlier, the core concern expressed there is premised on a misrepresentation of Google's plan. So putting that argument aside, right? There are a number of other concerns that have been expressed. So for one example is a concern about parental controls that we've thought about a lot and tried to solve for. The idea there being if a subscriber has opted into parental controls and your ISP is providing those through some filtered DNS service, if we switched over the DNS service to our partner, we might be disabling those parental controls, which we think would be a bad thing. So that's one concern that's been identified that we take quite seriously, which is why we have a mitigation in place to ensure that if we detect that parental controls are enabled, we won't turn on DOH. So there's a number of similar circumstances like that where there's some sort of purpose-built feature that we want to ensure remains in place. And our deployment plan essentially tries to solve for those by not deploying DOH or not turning on DOH if we detect that we're in one of those circumstances.
To your second question, the answer is yes. So sometimes DNS log requests, or DNS logs can be subpoenaed or retrieved by national security letter. This happens because the DNS provider for most people is the ISP. So when